Before the sun even touched the rooftops of Ouagadougou, a different kind of dawn broke. The streets were hushed, but the silence was pierced by the whir of helicopters circling above and the slow crawl of unmarked black vehicles that rolled into position. To the outside eye, these buildings looked harmless aid organizations, agricultural NGOs, and modern offices boasting glass panels and glossy banners. But when the soldiers pushed through the gates, the facade shattered. Inside lay racks of servers, encrypted routers, and years of stolen secrets. What began as an ordinary Thursday morning quickly became the day Africa awoke to the invisible chains wrapped around its future. 17 facilities, more than 2 million personal profiles, cabinet minutes, biometric scans, and even maps of Burkina Faso's mineral wealth. All siphoned quietly, flowing through hidden networks that reached far beyond the Sahel. And in that moment, Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his forces declared enough. The operation was swift, precise, and without warning, what many are now calling a continental turning point, Operation Clear Sight. But here's the real question. If a nation's heartbeat, its data, its secrets, its very identity is stored and controlled abroad, can it still claim to be sovereign? For 15 years, Africa's digital backbone has been quietly infiltrated under the banners of development and aid. Now, with the servers seized and the veil lifted, the continent must decide, will it remain a digital colony, or will it claim its independence in the age of code and cables? Brothers and sisters, this story is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa's future and about whether leaders like Ibrahim Traoré can set a precedent strong enough to resist the pressure of global powers. If your heart beats for freedom, stay with us. If you believe Africa bows to no one, let your voice be heard. Please share this message and subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. It began in the shadows of the early morning when most of Ouagadougou was still asleep. At exactly 5 a.m., Captain Ibrahim Traoré issued an order that would send ripples across the continent. By 7 a.m., security forces launched a simultaneous strike on 17 separate facilities scattered throughout the capital. The precision was surgical, coordinated to the minute so that not a single location had the chance to erase data or destroy evidence. On the city's eastern edge, one glass-paneled building carried the signboard of a digital agriculture NGO. To passing motorists, it looked like a hub of innovation, perhaps even a partner in food security. But when troops stormed the lobby, the truth emerged. Behind the polished walls were rows of servers, routers, connected to concealed lines and encryption hardware that investigators later traced directly to Herzliya, Israel, a city long associated with cyber intelligence industries. 2 blocks from the Ministry of Education, another raid revealed an even darker secret. Inside a low-profile warehouse, officials uncovered databases containing the personal records of nearly 2 million Burkinabe citizens. The files were staggering in scope: names, addresses, biometric scans, call logs, and metadata stretching back more than 8 years. Analysts confirmed that much of this information had been routed through hidden telecom systems designed to bypass national security firewalls. In plain terms, the very essence of citizenship had been commodified and exported without consent. As the morning progressed, additional teams reported success at 6 more facilities. Each location had operated under the guise of humanitarian assistance education programs, digital literacy centers, even international infrastructure partnerships. Outwardly, they appeared benevolent. Inwardly, they contained highly sophisticated surveillance hardware, satellite uplink stations, and encrypted documents. One file in particular raised alarm: a detailed map matching Burkina Faso's mineral deposits, including gold and manganese, with transport routes and logistical notes. Identical documents later traced to Tel Aviv suggested that the country's resources were being cataloged for foreign interests. By 8:45 a.m., all 17 sites were under military control. No casualties were reported. Witnesses described convoys of black vehicles stationed at intersections, soldiers carrying sealed crates of hard drives, and helicopters hovering low above government districts. On social media, short videos began to circulate within minutes, showing troops loading stacks of servers onto trucks under heavy guard. Hashtags like #Africa, not for sale, and #OurData, Our Choice trended across West Africa before midday, reflecting both anger and pride. Colonel Issoufou Zongo, spokesperson for the armed forces, addressed the press shortly afterward. What we discovered was not development assistance. It was systematic surveillance. Burkina Faso cannot tolerate the exploitation of its citizens' privacy, its natural resources, or its national security. His words echoed across the continent. Experts quickly recognized the scale of the operation. Dr. Samuel Kabore, a digital security researcher at the University of Ouagadougou, remarked, "This was not symbolic. It was decisive." For the first time, a West African nation has dismantled in public view a network that had been operating in the shadows for years. What struck many observers was the level of sophistication. Investigators reported encountering advanced encryption protocols rarely seen outside state intelligence agencies. They found routers embedded directly into national telecom switchboards, transmitting a copy of every government phone call abroad. Among the seized materials were intercepted cabinet discussions, including defense strategies and economic policy deliberations, information that could destabilize any government if leaked or manipulated. For the citizens of Ouagadougou, the morning felt surreal. At local markets, conversations shifted from the price of grain to whispers about stolen data and foreign control. Parents worried aloud. Were their children's school records now sitting on a server thousands of miles away? Young activists painted slogans on city walls: "Our data, our sovereignty." By the time the dust settled, it was clear that Operation Clearsight had not only uncovered espionage, it had exposed a new front in Africa's struggle for independence. No longer was sovereignty only about land or armies. It was about cable servers and the invisible flow of information that defines modern governance. Burkina Faso had taken the first public step, and the continent was watching. The morning after the raids, Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked up to the presidential podium in Ouagadougou. Cameras clicked, microphones crowded forward, and the nation held its breath. His words were sharp, deliberate, and unshakable. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are not your test subjects, and this continent will no longer be your blind spot. That sentence alone set the tone for a continental storm. Within hours, neighboring governments moved swiftly. In Bamako, Malian authorities announced the shutdown of 3 companies suspected of funneling data abroad. In Niamey, Niger's security forces neutralized a surveillance compound operating under diplomatic cover inside an embassy. In Conakry, Guinea's interim government froze all military imports linked to Israeli suppliers, declaring that the nation would not compromise its sovereignty, and in Lomé, Togo, suspended all new telecom contracts pending a full audit. It was as if the dominoes had been waiting for the first push and Burkina Faso had provided it. Crowds across the region surged into the streets. In Mali's capital, students chanted, "Africa is not for sale," while waving placards painted hastily overnight. In Conakry, mothers marched in silence, holding posters that read, "Digital sovereignty is national sovereignty." In Ouagadougou itself, young activists painted slogans on city walls: "Our data, our choice." What might have been dismissed as a local scandal had suddenly become the rallying cry of an entire generation. 2 days later, 6 heads of state, Mali, Guinea, Niger, Togo, Ghana, and Benin, gathered in a closed-door summit in Ouagadougou. The meeting, unannounced to international media, brought together advisors, ministers, and security chiefs. At the center of the conference table lay a folder filled with the most damning documents seized during Operation Clearsight. Traoré himself presented the evidence maps of mineral reserves matched against foreign databanks, intercepted cabinet discussions stored on offshore servers, and biometric profiles of millions of citizens siphoned abroad. The weight of the discovery left the room in silence. Then Traoré unveiled his proposal, a continental digital sovereignty framework. It rested on 4 uncompromising pillars. No foreign telecom investment without full transparency of infrastructure, hardware, and software ownership must be disclosed. All citizen data must be stored on servers physically located within African territory with no exceptions. Any undeclared intelligence activity by a foreign entity would trigger immediate expulsion and removal of diplomatic privileges. An attack on one nation's digital sovereignty would be treated as an attack on all, requiring a coordinated continental response. The discussion was tense but historic. Ghana's president emphasized that enforcement mechanisms were crucial, proposing oversight councils of engineers and civil society leaders rather than politicians. Togo's delegation insisted the framework must be binding law, not symbolic rhetoric. By the summit's close consensus had formed. Each leader signed a declaration recognizing digital sovereignty as a continental priority, the closest Africa had ever come to a Monroe Doctrine of the digital age. The symbolism was not lost on observers. For decades, West African leaders had met primarily to negotiate loans, aid packages, or peacekeeping deployments designed abroad. This time, they convened to defend themselves against the very powers that once claimed to help them. As Dr. Amadou Sissoko, a political scientist based in Bamako, observed, for the first time in a generation, West African presidents are uniting not to request assistance from abroad, but to safeguard themselves against it. Internationally, the reaction was swift. In Paris, newspapers branded Traore authoritarian. In London, opinion pieces warned that West Africa was drifting toward instability. In Washington, think tanks labeled his doctrine radical. Yet on the streets of Bamako, Conakry, and Ouagadougou, thousands of ordinary Africans hailed him as a defender of dignity. Hashtags such as #Africa Not For Sale and #Digital Sovereignty now dominated regional platforms. For many citizens, the raids and their aftermath were more than a security story, they were a declaration of independence reborn in the digital era. As one young demonstrator in Ouagadougou said on camera, "Our parents fought for land. We fight for our data. Both are freedom." By the end of that week, Operation Clearsight was no longer just a Burkina action. It had become a continental movement. In the weeks and months that followed Operation Clearsight, the shockwaves in Burkina Faso did not fade, they reshaped everyday life. What had begun as a military strike against hidden data centers quickly evolved into a social and political transformation that no one could ignore. For ordinary citizens, the most immediate change was emotional. In the markets of Ouagadougou, vendors no longer spoke only about grain prices or transport fares. They talked about privacy, about their children's digital future, and about whether their voices and images had been siphoned away without consent. Parents felt violated knowing that biometric scans, school records, and even health files had been sitting on servers far beyond Africa's borders. Many described it as a new kind of colonization, silent, bloodless, but no less dangerous. The government responded with a suite of sweeping reforms. A new law mandated that all citizen data must be stored inside national borders. Every foreign technology company operating in Burkina Faso was required to submit to third-party audits with the understanding that any non-compliance would result in immediate termination of contracts and expulsion from the country. These rules, once considered radical, quickly became the foundation of a new legal order: digital sovereignty as a national right. The political reverberations were just as significant. Traoré's decisive action emboldened other African leaders who had long hesitated to confront powerful foreign partners. Within the African Union, debates about infrastructure or security now carried a new phrase, repeated in chamber after chamber: "Our data, our choice." For the first time, digital sovereignty was discussed alongside land resources and defense as a pillar of statehood. Inside Burkina Faso, the operation boosted public trust in a government that had often been criticized for its transitional status. Citizens saw visible proof that their leaders were willing to act, not just speak, in defense of national dignity. Political analysts observed that Traoré's popularity surged not because he promised democracy in the Western sense, but because he demonstrated sovereignty in practice. Civil society, too, found its voice. Universities introduced courses on cybersecurity and governance. Student unions organized forums under banners like Independence 2.0. Street artists painted murals of broken chains made of fiber optic cables, while community radio stations aired nightly debates about surveillance and rights. For many, the experience of seeing their country reclaim control over invisible systems was as empowering as independence itself. But the changes were not only symbolic. 6 months after the raids, the government reported measurable progress. Internet speeds had doubled, data costs for consumers had dropped by nearly half, and cybersecurity breaches were down 47% compared with the year before. These statistics gave citizens tangible proof that sovereignty was not just about pride, it was about practical benefits that improved daily life. Yet challenges remained. Some foreign investors pulled out, calling the rules unworkable. Critics warned of economic isolation. Opposition voices questioned whether Burkina Faso had the capacity to maintain high-tech infrastructure without external partners. Still, a growing number of regional startups stepped in to fill the gap, proving that Africans could innovate when given the chance. In Accra, a Ghanaian firm launched a local cloud service. In Lagos, a fintech company relocated its servers from Europe back to Nigeria. These stories inspired hope that Operation Clearsight was planting the seeds of a homegrown digital economy. Politically, the doctrine of digital sovereignty also carried risks. Western governments hinted at sanctions, while think tanks in Washington labeled Burkina Faso radical. But for many in West Africa, these warnings felt like echoes of a past they were determined to escape. As one Burkinabe youth leader said during a rally, "We would rather walk alone than live forever in someone else's shadow." Operation Clearsight had started as a dawn raid. By the end of its first 6 months, it had become something larger, a redefinition of what it means to be free in the 21st century. From Washington to Brussels, the reverberations of Operation Clearsight were felt almost immediately. What African citizens hailed as a liberation, Western policymakers saw as a dangerous precedent. If Burkina Faso could expel powerful contractors and rewrite the rules of the digital game, what would stop others from following? In Paris, editorials portrayed Captain Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, a young officer undermining decades of French partnership in West Africa. London think tanks warned of regional destabilization, suggesting that stricter sovereignty rules could scare away investors and leave fragile economies vulnerable. In Washington, the reaction was sharper. Policy analysts labeled Burkina Faso's doctrine radical isolationism, while officials at the State Department cautioned against a trend they feared might erode American influence on the continent. But behind closed doors, some Western experts admitted a different truth. The revelations from Ouagadougou were credible, the evidence undeniable. Photographs of seized routers transmitting government calls abroad, intercepted cabinet minutes, and satellite maps of mineral reserves could not simply be dismissed as propaganda. Independent cybersecurity specialists in South Africa and Kenya confirmed the authenticity of the files, forcing Western governments to confront an uncomfortable question: how much of Africa's sovereignty had already been eroded under the guise of aid and technology partnerships. Not all global reactions were critical. In Beijing, state media celebrated the raids as a turning point for Africa's technological independence. Moscow quickly offered cybersecurity expertise and pledged to build data centers under African oversight. New Delhi promised to fund regional server infrastructure and train engineers, framing its support as a partnership of equals. These offers placed Africa in a unique diplomatic position, for once it was not begging for assistance, it was choosing among suitors. The divergence in narratives became stark on the world's screens. Western outlets framed Traoré as authoritarian, focusing on the risks of digital nationalism. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera called Operation Clearsight the unveiling of a hidden empire, while Russia's RT highlighted Western hypocrisy in demanding transparency abroad while concealing their own surveillance practices. China's Global Times described the new doctrine as Africa's Monroe Doctrine for the digital age. On the streets of New York, Chicago, and Atlanta, the story resonated with another audience: African Americans who saw in Traoré's stand echoes of their own struggles for dignity and self-determination. Social media threads connected the dots between digital surveillance in Africa and data exploitation in the United States. Commentators asked whether Africa's bold step could inspire minority communities elsewhere to demand greater control over their digital lives. In Europe, divisions soon emerged. German and Spanish firms rebranded themselves as sovereignty-compliant, rushing to align with Africa's new laws. French and British companies resisted, warning that the framework would choke investment. This split revealed fault lines inside the European Union itself, with some leaders urging engagement while others pressed for sanctions. For the United States, the dilemma was clear. On one hand, Washington could not afford to lose influence in a region it long considered strategically vital. On the other, overtly punishing Burkina Faso risked fueling the very Pan-African unity it feared most. As one U.S. analyst remarked in a leaked briefing, if Traoré becomes a symbol, it will not matter how small Burkina Faso is. The doctrine will spread, and with it our leverage will shrink. In the end, Operation Clearsight forced the world to take sides. Would nations support Africa's right to guard its digital borders as fiercely as its territorial ones? Or would they resist clinging to the privileges of an era when data flowed unchecked into servers beyond the continent? For Africa, the message was clear. The days of silent compliance were over. For America and its allies, the question now was whether they could adapt to a new reality, one in which Africa no longer bowed, but bargained. Operation Clear Sight began as a dawn raid in the streets of Ouagadougou, but it has since become something far larger, a symbol, a doctrine, and perhaps the opening chapter of Africa's second independence. The sight of soldiers carrying out servers under armed guard was not just the dismantling of espionage facilities. It was a declaration that sovereignty in the 21st century is no longer only about borders drawn on a map. It is about the unseen highways of fiber optic cables, the storage racks of servers, the algorithms that can shape economies and even elections. Yet the victory carries with it a heavy warning. External pressure is already mounting. Western think tanks call Traore radical sanctions are whispered in European halls, and investors hesitate. The danger is real. Without vigilance, unity, and resources, Africa's digital sovereignty could remain a slogan rather than a shield. Just as colonialism once adapted itself to new disguises, today's exploitation can return in subtler forms through apps, contracts, and cloud services that promise progress while stealing control. But there is also hope. In 6 short months, citizens have seen cheaper internet, stronger protections, and new opportunities for local startups. Students debate sovereignty in classrooms, mothers march with placards declaring, "Our data, our choice," and young leaders paint walls with chains of fiber cable breaking apart. The cultural narrative has shifted. Independence is no longer just remembered. It is being redefined in real time. This is the challenge and the promise. Can Africa sustain the momentum? Can leaders turn declarations into laws, laws into infrastructure, and infrastructure into freedom that endures? Or will the weight of external pressure bend the continent back into dependency? And here, brothers and sisters, is where you come in. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's doctrine of digital sovereignty is enough to protect Africa's future? Or should the continent prepare for even deeper reforms to secure independence once and for all? Can we trust him to lead, or must Africa consider who will succeed him to carry this torch forward? Please share if you feel that you are among the first to recognize and support President Ibrahim Traoré's struggle for Africa's sovereignty. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. And never forget, the story of Operation Clear Sight is not only about Burkina Faso, it is about all of us, about whether Africa bows to anyone or finally stands tall in its own strength. Africa bows to no one.